before I get too much into that, let's step back a little bit and sort of ask the question, well, from an evolutionary perspective, why do we get cancers late in life? So we look at curves of cancer incidence. As I said before, 90% of these are going to occur in ages after 50. And really the same is true for many other diseases of aging, like heart disease, for example. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, if you look at the survival of humans, any time, before a few hundred years ago, really, but this curve is from Europeans about 15,000 years ago, but it could really represent any population on Earth thousands of years ago. Basically, your odds of living past 50 were relatively small. And your odds of contributing to the next generation genetically were even smaller. So you could sort of think of cancer and heart disease as not a sort of a means to get rid of us, but sort of the waning of a program to maintain us. The strength of natural selection to prevent these diseases waned in later ages, because basically you were likely to be dead by some other cause, whether it was starvation, disease, or some large cat. And so this is the perspective that we need to think of cancer. Why is it that this waning of this investment in our soma, our bodies, is leading to cancers late in life? And that's the crux of the theory that my lab's been developing for the last almost 20 years now. So the first principle we need to think of is that natural selection has acted over millions of years to maintain animal bodies to the extent that maximizes reproductive success. You can essentially think about this as an investment strategy. And if you think about natural selection acting as an investor, but in some ways a blind investor, the investment is to the extent that's going to maximize the return on that investment. And the return on that investment is an offspring. And so to invest in a human body that would last for 100 years, for example, would have been a wasted investment because your odds of making it, much past 50 were so small because of other reasons that you were going to die. And instead, that energetic investment would have been better used for production of offspring and youth. So the investment is maximize youth, but don't worry so much about the long game because you're not likely to be around for the long game. And what does this mean? So one of the key points of our theory is that maintaining tissues in their youthful state is potently tumor suppressive. So normal healthy tissues impede the development of malignancies, of cancers. And I'll get more into this as we go along, but I think this is really key because often we think about, we get cancer late in life because the mutations are accumulating. What we're arguing is that no, you can get those mutations when you're young, but they're simply not advantageous to the cell. They can't contribute to a malignancy because the environment of the body is basically inhibiting them. And the second principle is the more depressing one. And that's that aging and tissue damage select for change. So just like I talked about after that meteor hit off the Yucatan 65 or 66 million years ago, and that ended up selecting for all these new mammalian species, that same thing happens in our bodies as our tissues change. So an older person's lung is no longer the same as a younger person's lung, particularly if that person was a smoker. And that difference in that environment selects for new types that are adaptive to that new environment, just like happens in real evolution. And sometimes the selection for change can lead to cancer. So then the question is, can we understand this better? Are there means to measure aging and associated disease risk? And it turns out there are. So one of them, I'll just call them epigenetic clocks. Don't worry too much about that, what that means. These are basically ways of looking at changes in the marks on our DNA. And what they've noted is that those marks will change as we get older, but they change at different rates for different people. And if you have accelerated change in that clock, that's a harbinger of bad things that are going to happen to you. And if you have less change in those clocks, that's a marker of that basically your odds of living longer and not getting disease are even greater. But another one that's really been quite exciting, and it's really come about in the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years has really been the major work in it, is in this area of what's called clonal hematopoiesis. And what these are mutations that happen in our blood stem cells that lead to expansions. And what different groups have shown is that these expansions increase as we get older. And so if you're in your 80s, for example, depending on the different study, you have somewhere about a 15 or 20% chance of having one of these expansions. But clearly that means that you can be an 80-year-old and not have one of these expansions. And so when they've looked, they've shown that having these expansions is a strong risk factor for a number of different diseases, leukemias, but not just leukemias, any cancer, even cancers that seem to have nothing to do with the blood system, but also even for other diseases like cardiovascular disease. So there's sort of indicators of our overall physiological decline. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, is that looking at decline in one tissue can often be indicative of decline in another tissue. And then another important point that I want to raise is that this is an area of research that has been heavily promoted and even funded by the Samuel Waxman Cancer Research Foundation. Some of the really top labs working in this area, like Ross Levine and Ben Ebert and Peggy Goodell, have been funded by this organization. And I think it's a really critical way to understand the decline in what we call our soma, the body, the tissues. And finally, there are serum markers as well. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of example. Don't go to sleep quite yet. This is a little bit of data that from our lung cancer research. So as Sam was mentioning, we're funded by the NIA together with the Samuel Waxman Cancer Research Foundation. And that funding is going to support our research in blood malignancies. And I'm not going to show you any of that today, although that's a very active area of research in my lab, because this lung cancer example, I think, is quite simple and dramatic. And so this research was carried out by 2 students, along with a pulmonary fellow who were in my group. So the first thing I'll do is show you a little bit of sort of data from the population. So whether you get lung cancer is determined by smoking. So this is, for example, men that smoke and their risk of lung cancer. And this is men who've never smoked and their risk of lung cancer. Clearly, one does not need to be a genius to figure out that it's a bad idea to smoke if you wanted to avoid lung cancer. The risk of lung cancer goes up about 20-fold in smokers relative to never smokers. And there's similar associations in women. But what I think is important, if you notice, before 40, for both smokers and non-smokers, the risk of lung cancer is quite low. And you can see this on what's called a log-log scale, where you're basically looking at it with a 10-fold increase where you normally have a linear scale. And you can see that the 2 curves are parallel. So whether you get lung cancer, yeah, that's determined by smoking. But when you get it is determined by your age. So there seems to be this power of youth, which isn't even shown on this curve because it's before 40. This power of youth to prevent the lung cancers is even active in someone who is abusing their lungs with cigarette smoke. So what happens in old age to our lungs? So we know there's a lot of changes in functional capacity. So reduced vital capacity, weakening of breathing muscles, and increased fibrosis. And much of this will happen independent of how you live. I mean, it's not just due to pollution or smoking and so forth, which certainly accelerate all these processes, but just the fact that we get old. And declining in the adaptive immune function, upregulation of inflammation. Our lungs are not the same as when we were young. And again, think back to that evolutionary reason. We were very unlikely to reach these ages for most of our evolutionary history. And so there really was an investment to maintain this tissue to the point that it would be maintain the health and vigor of our body. So then what we asked is, well, does this influence whether or not tumors form? And I won't go into how we did the experiment, but we introduced in known cancer-causing events that are associated with human lung cancers into the lungs of these mice. And we do that at equal frequencies across these different age groups. So the mutations are introduced equally, but in the young background, almost all the mice, each of which is noted with the little dash here, don't get any tumors. And a couple of the mice get a couple of small tumors. So largely the young seem to be resistant to this tumor forming, but the old mice get lots of tumors, and each mouse gets multiple tumors, and they tend to be much bigger tumors. So again, youth is tumor suppressive. But then the question, so that's great, but that's kind of depressing. Can we do anything about it? And so we also have these old mice, same age as these, but they express a transgene. And again, I won't get into what this does, but just keep in mind this AAT is anti-inflammatory. And in this case, basically, we got a pattern that was very similar to young. So even though these mice were old, they were now resistant to the ability of this cancer-causing event to cause one of these adenomas, which is shown over here on the right. And that's I think, important, because even though we're not going to start making transgenic humans at any point soon, this suggests that modulating an environment in the lung, in this case through an anti-inflammatory, could be a useful means to lower the risk of cancers. And we've done a lot of molecular analyses on these lungs. And I want to point out a few things. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of how we did this, but each of these little kind of bars is one protein that's being detected through a method called proteomics, where we look at thousands of proteins at once. And what you'll note is that, for example, the blue means very low levels and red means very high levels. So these different proteins all go up a lot in old age. But that anti-inflammatory transgenic prevented that increase. So that's good. So it says we're reversing some of these aging associated effects. But equally as important is, I'll point out that there's some stuff that goes up in old age that still goes up in old age in the transgenic, and other stuff that goes down in old age and still goes down in the transgenic. So I don't want you to walk away thinking that we've completely rejuvenated these lungs. I think we'd be up for a Nobel Prize if we managed to do that. No, we've rejuvenated components of the lungs. But if you remember back from the previous slide, whatever we did seem to prevent the cancers from happening. So in some ways, I think this is hopeful, because basically what it says is we may not have to completely rejuvenate the lung to prevent lung cancers. We just have to figure out what are the key factors. And presumably they're going to be among these changes that did get reversed. Those are the ones we need to figure out and work on, because we can maybe come up with much more targeted means to prevent whatever changes happen with old age that could then lower the risk of lung cancer. So essentially the model's this. We may get mutations throughout our life, and this is actually mimicking real data that's been out there on changes in our DNA that happen as we get old. So a lot of these still happen when we're young. Everyone is accumulating mutations every day, many of which are cancer causing. But during youth, when natural selection acted to basically make sure we could reproduce, so needed to keep us healthy and alive, there was what we call stabilizing selection. Essentially, change is disfavored. The status quo is maintained. So our tissues prevent change from happening. But what happens late in life? Now, this is the point where natural selection is no longer acting to maintain our bodies, the soma. Now you get positive selection. You get selection for cancer-causing events that could contribute to a cancer. And that's what I just showed you with those adenomas. They're selectively happening in old. What we need to figure out is, how do we suppress this? How do we better maintain whatever features of the youthful state that are suppressing cancer? How do we better maintain those in old age? So these are some of the current efforts. And this is not just in my lab, I'll mention. In fact, this is happening in many of the labs that are funded or associated with the Samuel Waxman Foundation. So we need to develop safe interventions that can reduce aging-associated cancers by promoting tissue health. So one of the things we're working on are anti-inflammatory drugs, including antibodies. But I'll put a real note of caution here. I don't think we're going to end up just doing a simple anti-inflammatory, because we have inflammation for a reason. Inflammation is important, for example, to fight off bacteria and viruses and so forth. And so we can't just take a brute force effort here. We have to figure out how to tune it appropriately. Another idea is to use what are called senolytics. These eliminate senescent cells in our body. So these are cells that are literally old cells in our body, but they're they would seem to be non-functional. They don't divide anymore. They just get big and ugly, but they secrete a lot of factors that can induce inflammation. And there's really been some beautiful work showing that if we eliminate these, we might be able to maintain youthfulness longer. But actually, I would actually propose that one of the best ways of maintaining our soma is something that your mother already told you about when you were young, and that was exercise and diet. And so, doing everything that we know we should be doing is actually probably the best and surest way to maintain our soma. And finally, I'll mention that we're working with some preclinical studies and mouse models to test some of these ideas. And there's some stuff happening in clinical trials that are testing different interventions, particularly with high-risk populations that I'm associated with, and I'm sure there are many other labs doing this as well. And finally, before I finish, I just wanted to bring up some of the parallels with COVID-19. So again, over here on the left side, you see this is the increased risk of different causes of death as we get older. And you can see that for up until almost 80, cancer is a major cause of our death. Those are the colored bars. But these next two bars are different cardiovascular diseases, heart diseases, and you can see that they are quite prominent as well. And same thing in men and women. Now, if you notice on the right, this is COVID-19 death rates. And essentially, I'll argue it's the same curve. Most of the deaths are after the age of 50, and it increases exponentially. And in fact, actually, this curve is obviously not from the last few months, because for the last few months, at least in the United States and some other countries, COVID-19 has overtaken cancers and heart disease as the #1 cause of death. So that tells you it's also very age dependent. So some of the take-home messages are that the efforts to prevent and treat cancers should converge with similar efforts to prevent other aging associated diseases like COVID-19. We basically need means to shore up our bodies, the soma, to improve defenses against malignant actors. So I've been talking about the malignant actors as literal malignancies, as cancer cells. But I think we could think of these malignant actors as viruses, as other factors that could lead to our demise. Now, I'm not saying that we are going to be able to live forever. But the idea is in some ways to flatten the curve, just like we're flattening the curve for the COVID-19, but to flatten the curve so that instead of having individuals, for example, dying of cancers in their 50s and 60s, to sort of push our survival and our wellness out further, particularly our health span. And I think of this in some ways is a sort of a different strategy, even sociology. If we think about how do we approach things like crime and terrorism, often the impulse is let's eliminate the terrorists and the criminals. But in some ways, we really know that if you really want to prevent those things, you need a better environment. You need an environment that's not conducive to the criminal or the terrorist actor. And finally, we need to leverage markers of a declining soma, like CHIP, as an ecosystem check for our soma. So we know who are the people that really need intervention. Are these the people that are showing signs that they have a declining soma? Can we intervene specifically for those individuals? So that's all I got. And let me see if I'll stop sharing, and then I think I should be able to find the questions. But
so I will say a few words, James.
Sure.
Firstly, your presentation was extremely informative and really makes you think about a lot of basic mechanisms that one can start to generate in our daily life. Research has neglected this association. You've made it clear that aging is a risk factor in many ways for the common diseases that we face as we get older. And you've made a very nice demonstration that in the mouse model, that was an older mouse versus a younger mouse, one would get a much greater degree of cancer based on the change in age. Mm-hmm. Now, this type of research is just beginning to grow. Most research was done without thinking about age as a risk factor. And you're showing it so well in lung cancer that it won't tell you whether you'll get it, but it will tell you when you get it.
Right.
And so for sure, the same type of clonal generations that one would see in the stem cell of leukemia, you see when you study it in lung cancer. And so we have a problem now to recognize these new markers. People want to know, for example, how can I obtain this kind of information, or should I obtain it?
Right.
Is it ethical for someone to know they're at a higher risk for getting cancer based on one of the markers or having clonal hematopoiesis, et cetera? So what would I tell them? Would I tell them to get these markers done or not?
Yeah, I would say my sort of impulse is, and I'm not an MD, so I shouldn't be giving any medical advice, but is that we shouldn't give any test for risk if we don't have something that we can do about it, right? So if, let's say that we develop means to intervene specifically in people that have this clonal hematopoiesis, this chip, if we do that, then I think that then it's worth getting the test, because then you go in with eyes wide open. It's sort of like having your cholesterol checked. Well, you have your cholesterol checked because there's something you can do about it, right? And so I think we need to have actionable, approaches to address the individuals that do have a higher risk. And it may be that we start off with high risk populations to begin with. So some of the studies that I'm involved in, where we're over at the VA hospital, are on smokers and former smokers. So we're not doing these studies on the general population. We're doing them on people that are already at high risk. And then we can actually suggest, if they have something that looks pre-malignant, we can suggest some interventions that they can go through. So that would be, I would say, the key thing there. In regards to what you're talking about, I'm sorry, Sam. I was just going to say.
Yeah, I would. Go ahead. I'll comment after.
Yeah, so I think that it is really critical that research start to address aging as more than just time, because a lot of people have sort of felt that if they wanted to study cancer, they can make mouse models where they simply create the mutations that would have otherwise occurred during the lifetime. And essentially, it doesn't matter the mouse is young because they put in all those mutations. They bypass the aging. But what I argue is that they haven't bypassed the aging, because aging is more than just the accumulation of mutations. You need that environmental change. And I think even as we think of immune therapies, all these studies of immune therapies are being done in young mice, but almost all the patients are going to be older. And go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so I'll talk from the MD point of view in relation to the need for developing clinical trials and clinics to actually study people at risk for cancer as they age, as recognized by having a marker. And there are such programs going on now throughout the world where we can find the risk factor, we can define the actual biochemical manifestation of that, and begin to try to prevent it, but most of all, much more closely observe a person and catch cancer before it happens on the basis of these markers. So I think there's a great need to have an aging and cancer clinic in every institution of cancer center, and they're beginning to happen now.
Yeah.
Now, as far as some clinical trials, you mentioned them briefly, the senolytics, the idea of trying to remove the senescent cell and to keep your tissues, let's say, healthier, because those are bad players and may rapidly make people older because of their presence. And there are drugs that are in clinical trial. Have you had any experience in animal models using these agents to prevent aging and cancer?
We've started using some of the pharmacological means. We haven't used the transgenic models, but we've started using them, and we just haven't done enough. So I can't say anything positive. In other words, we did it and it didn't show much of an effect, but honestly, we would have to do more than just one experiment to really look at them. So yes, we've started, but nothing, it's not a major focus of my lab right now.
Right. So James, would you take a minute to talk about the new journal that your editor-in-chief of? Because I think it's going to have really international impact.
Yeah, so we've formed a new journal. This is with Wiley, the publisher. It's called Aging and Cancer. And really, the goal is for it to serve as a forum for a wide range of interdisciplinary research in the area of aging and cancer. And it's really quite amazing. You know, I mean, I showed everyone the curves where, you know, the number one factor, if you want to know what someone's risk of cancer is, the first thing you'd ask them is their age. And then you could ask them, are you a smoker and so forth. But it's the number one factor in terms of your risk. And yet very little attention has been paid to it. And there's certainly been no forum like this specifically sort of targeted to understand these associations between aging and cancer. And the goal of this journal is to make it, you know, really span from the very basic bench work in model organisms. You can even imagine stuff being done in flies and fish and so forth, all the way towards clinical studies and understanding, for example, how frailty measures influence what sort of drug that a patient would get. And that may seem very broad, but what I found in sort of my associating with such diverse entities and different diverse areas of interest is that learning about these other areas has changed even the way that we do our research. And so bringing such different minds together in one journal, I think is an important enterprise. And we have a strong association with China on this one too. The other editor-in-chief is located in China.
James, one of the topics that you talked about, which is incredibly important, is the role of exercise and diet.
Yes.
Okay. I'm aware of really good mouse models that have shown that exercising mice or hamsters is a dramatic way of improving the immune system and inhibiting tumor growth or recurrence. You think that it's been demonstrated in people?
Yeah,
is
no,
a mouse phenomenon, or can we really demonstrate that in our species?
No, it's been shown quite well that, you know, for example, if they just either by questionnaires or different measures, people that regularly exercise live longer and have less cancer. So the data are quite solid on that. And we even know, it's funny because it even ties into, you know, if you ask in model organisms, like what are the pathways that are modulated to promote longer lifespans? So, you know, they could select, for example, for flies that live longer. And there's these common pathways, whether it's flies, worms, or mice, or even yeast, that are modulated to allow for longer life. What's interesting is when people or animals or, you know, whatever your favorite species is exercise, they're activating those same pathways. So in other words, the same pathways that evolution has used to modulate lifespan are being used in the, you know, within an individual when we exercise. So we even know the molecular mechanisms for how this works. And we're very interested in pursuing this, and we're going to use it in some of our cancer initiation models. It could be as simple as just giving the mice a wheel, because you give a mouse a wheel and they will run like crazy. You don't have to prod them to run. They love to run.
Yeah, this is really very exciting. And when we were talking about aging and cancer clinics, could you imagine someone that has high risk factors, these markers, epigenetic markers and mutations? Could you conceive of those being reversible or
right.
a reaction against them with proper exercise and
right.
diet?
Yeah, in fact, so I would actually, yeah, I'm sorry, Sam. Yeah, I would actually, you know, and actually it even goes beyond aging. They've even shown that with chemotherapy, so we know that people get chemotherapy for their cancer. Like, for example, kids that have childhood leukemias, and they have a lifelong increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And so now that's better than dying as a kid of cancer. So that's one of the side effects. But they've shown, at least now through mouse models, and I know there are clinical studies ongoing, that if you have mice exposed to chemo, but then you have them exercise right after it, that it actually greatly reduces the cardiovascular problems that would otherwise develop. So just having that exercise going on, and the same thing actually is true for senolytics, by the way, but it seems to prevent that from happening. So I would argue that doctors, in addition to giving their pills and medicines, need to be giving every patient a Fitbit or some, you know, some sort of exercise watch, right? And you can imagine you could definitely do this with kids, because you could work with a reward system. You know, if they do X amount on their, you know, of exercise during the week after they've gotten their chemo, that they get some reward. But I think it could have huge benefits. And such things like exercise, there may not be a pill involved in it, but the effect on outcomes could be just dramatic.
All right. James, are there any questions that you see?
No, I could go to them right now. I'd see 3 in the Q&A, and then there's 1 in the chat. Let me start with the Q&A ones. Marion Waxman, I imagine that's related to you, has said, what diet would you recommend? And so I think honestly, the first thing I would always say is, and again, I'm not a professional, but from what I know, a diverse diet that includes lots of fruits and vegetables. But in my opinion, we evolved to be as omnivores, and we should continue being omnivores. And so it's sort of like, I tend to be a moderate in every aspect of my life, and moderation is the key. It's the same thing, like what I say, never drink alcohol. No, you can have a beer or a glass of wine a night, but should you drink a whole bottle of wine? Of course not. It's a question of moderation. I'd say the same thing with diet. We want a diverse diet. You want to eat lots of fruits and vegetables. There actually may be some diets that might even be more tailored to activate those evolutionary pathways I was just talking about. So for example, they've shown certain components in diet like spermidine seem to be better activators of those pathways. And spermidine's found in things, actually it's funny because it's found in all the things I really love, like aged cheeses and mushrooms and stuff like that. But again, I'd be careful with someone going overboard with that. I'd say, again, just have a diverse diet and you'll probably do okay. Okay, the second question is from, I think it's Jürgen Ostertag. Could you please address the positive factor of less cell growth activity in older age? I'm not sure that's a positive factor. And in fact, that may be one of the factors that leads to selection for cancer-causing events, because essentially you can imagine as all the cells reduce their ability to replicate, that's going to select for, a cell that gets a mutation that boosts its replication ability. So, in some ways we often think that having less replication should be anti-cancer, but it's actually in some ways the opposite. Having robust cells that have the capacity to divide, but do so in a measured, monitored fashion, that's really what's ideal is in terms of competitiveness. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that youthful tissues are actually extremely competitive, and a cell that changes its behavior gets really thrown out of the pack. And it's sort of like a quality control mechanism. So if anything, I'd say less cell growth activity in older age. I'm not sure that's a contributing factor. Now, what it may be doing is, I don't know if anyone noticed, but the rate of cancer actually dips after about 80, 85. It doesn't go down to when you're young, but it's like less than when you're 70, for example. That may have something to do with the fact that the cell growth is just so sort of dampened at that point that a cancer is less likely to develop. But that's really speculation. All right, so we have an anonymous question. In addition to diet and exercise, are there over-the-counter vitamins and supplements that might add to the immunization effort? I would say I wouldn't recommend anything without solid clinical evidence. And I think, in other words, so I would recommend no vitamins or supplements. I mean, if you want your vitamins, eat a balanced diet with lots of fruits and vegetables. All the evidence so far with supplements, for example, in terms of like, do antioxidant supplements increase lifespan? Do they decrease cancer incidence? They've pretty much all those studies have been negative or even shown increased negative outcomes. So meaning they either showed no benefit or actually that people did worse. We have to be careful. We're dealing with highly balanced and complicated biochemical systems in our body. And I think we taking a supplement that, if I tell you that spermidine is a good thing, that doesn't mean that 1,000 times the natural amount of spermidine is a good thing. That means that the amount of spermidine that we would get from eating a healthy diet is probably a good thing. Same thing is true for most nutrients. It's not to say that those nutrients aren't doing us good, but they're doing us probably the most good in the form that we evolved to take them, which is in food. So I'm wary of vitamins and supplements. And I think right now I would not take anything that someone said is going to extend my lifespan. The only thing I'm going to do is exercise and eat a balanced diet. All right. And so Edward Sadovnik said, what about a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet? I mean, I'm not a dietitian. I do think that, you know, obviously lots of fruits and vegetables is a great idea. And it's probably, I mean, I do think the vegan diet, from my understanding, it can be difficult to do that well. It's not saying it's impossible because of you have to make sure you get some of those nutrients that are normally provided in meats. But from my understanding, a lacto-ovo diet can essentially supply those. So if you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, you're still getting your protein. I mean, but again, I'm not a dietitian, so be a little cautious. David Landay asked, are there types of exercise that are more likely to prevent cancer than others? Well, I'm a runner, so I'm going to say running. But honestly, they're actually probably you do need exercise that gives you, you know, sort of aerobic exercise that gets the heart beating. I don't think I would first say that in terms of like cancer, the studies have not gotten down to that sort of resolution. So if you're exercising and you're exercising a fair bit, you're probably going to be just fine. I wouldn't sweat it too much. In terms of longevity, some of the best studies have been done with runners, and there's clear evidence, but that doesn't mean that other forms of exercise aren't positive as well. And then John Hornbostel asked, does walking count as exercise, or is the fact that getting the heart rate up past a certain point? It's funny, I just kind of addressed that. I mean, everything's better than nothing, and walking is actually great exercise. It probably, for some benefits, I do think there's been some evidence that you do need to get the heart rate up, but you might be able to do that by walking fast. But again, doing activity is always better than less activity. Is drinking water regularly important? I don't know about the direct evidence for that. I tend to drink a fair bit of water, but I mean, I can't say from an evidence point of view. It just seems sort of makes sense that we want to maintain our hydrated state. And then Marion Waxman again said, what is the biological mechanism that running has on the cardiovascular system? Sam, do you want to answer that one? Do you know? I mean, I know more sort of overall physiology. It improves tissue fitness. It basically, but I actually can't tell you specifically about the cardiovascular system. I don't know if you can, Sam.
Well, I'm not going to try. No, basically it's physiology, but I don't understand. I don't know enough about the metabolism.
Yeah.
But you know, it's interesting from these questions that people are comfortable about asking about diet and exercise.
Yeah.
And I want to leave a thought that what we really need is research. We need to understand the basic mechanisms. There's not going to be a simple diet answer or an exercise answer to this. This is a field where we're just beginning to understand the problem. You brought up mutations, and mutations are present very early in life.
Yeah.
And some of them stay around and they don't mean anything, or others seem to make cancer happen. So I think we also have to understand what these mutations mean. Are there good mutations? Are there mutations necessary to get to be 80 or 90? As you say, major environmental impact generates natural selection. How is that done? It's done through mutations in order to survive, or changing gene expressions to overcome a significant inflammatory process.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't maybe think about these mutations as necessary in order to live longer, and somehow at the same time others are detrimental as part of the aging process and unable to deal with them. Right. So I think people should walk away from this saying this is an important area for research. Clinical trials are happening as we speak now. They're showing some impact in animal models that you can decrease the incidence of cancer as you overcome inflammation, as you've shown very well in an older mouse. And these trials will become more and more mainstream, so that in addition to diet, in addition to exercise, maybe we'll be taking something on a clinical trial, and people are already doing that as we speak now. So James, I'd like to thank you for really inspiring us with science, philosophy, you're now a nutritionist and everything else. So I look forward to working with you. We'll see you in September at the scientific review.
Yes, I look forward to
Probably
it.
a virtual conference, annual review of all our investigators. Folks, James is one of 60 SWCRF investigators that we're funding at this time. And we're really proud to have this person be part of our Institute Without Walls. Now I'd like to send this to our host, Jerry Joyce, who's going to close this conversation with a few words. Jerry?
Yes, James and Sam, many thanks for what I thought was a thoughtful and fascinating presentation on what's going on to find out the relationships between cancer and aging. Be very interested to see what you find out down the road. And if you'd like to know more about the Samuel Waxman Cancer Research Foundation, its website is www.waxmancancer.org. But just as importantly, we'd love to hear from you about what you thought about the webinar. If you have questions in the research being done, any of us would love to talk to you, and myself and Dan Ordan, for coming today. And please pay attention and look for future announcements about upcoming webinars by the Samuel Waxman Cancer Research Foundation. Have a great day.
Thank you for attending. The webinar is now ending.